Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Hi, and welcome to Self-Improvement Atlas, the Personal Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm Marie Stella, your host from Melbourne, Australia. Let's start the show. Hello, and welcome back to Self-Improvement Atlas, the Personal Science Insights podcast. Trauma is an all too common companion in life, leaving deep scars on the psyche and the spirit. Yet there exists a path to healing, a light at the end of the tunnel, if you will, that is accompanied by meditation. So in this episode, we are joined by an expert in the field, Dessa Bergen-Cico, who is a professor in the Department of Public Health as well as faculty at the Interdisciplinary Neuroscience Program at Syracuse University. And apart from that, she is a certified addiction specialist, certified health education specialist, and a certified mindfulness-based stress reduction teacher. Hi, Dessa. How are you going?
I'm doing wonderful. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us at such a late hour on your end. Now, I'm really curious to know, in your line of work, what's the most common misconception you've heard about meditation?
I think there's a couple of things. One is there's a concern or a misperception that it's religious in basis, and which it is not. It's really a secular practice. The other is that sometimes people think that they need to empty their mind and have no thoughts whatsoever, which can be a challenge. And that in reality, what it is it's really a practice of becoming just familiar with understanding how your mind operates and watching what it does and using sort of that stillness as a backdrop to get more familiar with and get insight with what your mind does.
Right, that's really interesting. I have to admit, I'm definitely one of those people that thought that meditation meant that you really have to clear your head and just be rid of all of the thoughts. So it's very relieving to hear that you don't have to be completely free of thoughts, because that's been my main stressor for not being able to do meditation. So I'm really keen to learn more. It's a great preface for a topic for today. But before we go further into detail, we'd love to get to know you better. This is Have You Met Dessa? And my first question for you is, what do you like to do in your spare time?
Anybody who knows me knows that one of my favorite pastimes is running. Although these days I have to do a little bit more walking than running, but it's for me a form of moving meditation and a way of connecting with the outdoors.
Yeah, for sure. And walking is such an easy way to do that as well. It's minimal effort. It's something that most people can do, and you don't have to have a truckload of gear to do it. Unlike things like fishing. So that's great that you have that. Do you happen to listen to any music while you're walking or running?
I generally try not to because I find there's just so much sensory input and overload that I try to use it as a time to disconnect from a lot of technology and input of information. I do, however, have podcasts that I like to listen to. And I find that depending on what the content of those podcasts is, it really makes a big difference in terms of my emotional state on the other end of my run.
Yeah, that is so true. And I feel like if you just switch off and stay away from technology for a while on one of your walks, you really start to notice some things about the nature around you that you probably haven't noticed before. But when you're listening to podcasts on your walks, on your runs, what kind of podcasts do you like to listen to?
One of the ones I like to listen to is the Huberman Lab, and so he does a great job of looking at sort of neuroscience from a perspective of the everyday person. How does it apply and make sense to our day to day lives? And so that's one that I enjoy. And then also Tammy Simon has a series from the Sounds True series of podcasts, which are a little bit more sort of um, spiritual, often have a lot of components of looking at how do you integrate mind body practices into your daily life.
Yeah, those sounds like great ones. Is there anything about these podcasts that just keeps you coming back for more?
What I like about them is both of them they often have guest speakers who do a lot of research, and what they provide is an opportunity to condense that information down into everyday speak and save the time and effort of reading more scholarly articles and research that is just on top of what I have to do as part of my work anyways. And it's a way to kind of get the highlights and application of that information over a wide breadth of areas and applying it to your everyday practices and staying current in information.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, completely. It does really help when there's someone doing that because sometimes, like, going through all the scholarly articles and like it's so many pages long and sometimes you're reading through the methodology and you're like what's like okay, and then you're skipping to the conclusion and you're like okay, but how did you do it, and then you're skipping back, and it's sometimes a lot of work just to read it, so I totally get you there. And especially on top of all the academia that you already have to do in your line of work, yeah, it sounds like a really great one for you. So I'm really glad you found those, and it's a really good time for podcasts as well because it's so saturated now. There's so many different kinds of podcasts on the market, so there's really almost something for everybody. And so yeah, that's great. But
I'm looking forward to
yes.
your podcast as it has more and more episodes expanding on it. This can be one of my new favorite go-tos as well.
Ah, thank you. I really appreciate that. Yeah, we hope so too. We hope to get there one day. We love exploring these topics as well. But as far as media consumption goes, what other types of media do you like to consume?
I found I during sort of lockdown and COVID, I was spent a lot of time with Netflix and things like that, and it just kind of also became one of those elements of just too much information coming in. So I actually have been on a practice of kind of doing what I call a media fast and keeping myself disconnected, which I think is actually incredibly helpful. Our topic today, we're going to talk a little bit about trauma and meditation and the exposure to world traumatic events through media can have a profound impact on us. And disconnecting from that or making a conscious choice over what you connect with, whether it's current events, information, or sometimes the content of some of the media that we engage in, it can be a skillful way of self-care.
Yeah, for sure. And as much as engaging in some types of media can really provoke your thoughts, you know, overconsumption of it at times can lead you to like slow down in your thinking and not really think for yourself as much. I am really trying to find the words to articulate this right here, but it's not coming out quite right. But I think you get what I mean. Well, my last question for you was: do you have a role model either in your professional life or your personal life?
That's a good question. I certainly must. There are people that I admire, um, but I don't have anyone that I think of currently as a role model per se.
Yeah. And what kind of traits do you find admirable in the people that you look up to?
Honesty, which is sometimes a very difficult one to come by these days. Honesty and kindness are two of the uh, factors that I think you can't go wrong with. Sometimes it
Yeah.
doesn't always serve the person well, but those are the things I absolutely admire in folks.
Yeah, for sure. Especially those people who are able to be honest while being kind. It's an exceptional trait and or skill to have that definitely takes a lot of empathy and thinking for yourself to develop as well. So it's great to hear more about yourself. Now that we've learned a bit more about you, I love to go into the interview section. And my first question for you is, how would you define personal development?
I would define personal development as, and the one aspect it takes some aspect of self knowledge, knowing where or having a sense of where do you feel maybe a void or a need that you're seeking to sort of do some corrective action or to improve upon. So having that sense of awareness about that something maybe could be strengthened or sometimes sort of corrective action.
Yeah.
And that knowing that and then being able to sort of seek out information, skill development, or resources to strengthen whatever feels like it's maybe not in the right place. And I don't mean that in the sense of sort of personal development or self-improvement that we have to always be striving for something. But I know in my own case, for example, sometimes I might be less than kind to someone and I realize I'm like, you know what, I'm short fused. I've got too much going on. There's something that I need to kind of rebalance. Sometimes it takes some reflection and knowing kind of where to go to for the sources of information or inspiration to grow in those areas.
Yeah. And how would you define meditation? And how do you think it contributes to our personal development as well?
Uh, if I look at the definition of meditation, so there can be kind of a broad range of what we think of sometimes as contemplative practices. The areas that I work on most and are really looking at what we call mindfulness-based meditation, and it's a means of intentionally bringing your focus towards self-reflection and awareness of the habits of the mind, and not necessarily being directed towards any particular outcome, but sort of being quiet and still and closing off sensory intake and information so that you can watch the habits of your mind, become familiar with the habits of your mind, and be aware of sort of what is coming up for you. So we'll have what's coming up for me today in meditation is not the same thing that was maybe coming up for me last Friday, right?
Yeah.
And so it helps us to be aware of what is most resonant for me and most necessary at this time. And in that quiet and in that stillness, there can be a lot of clarity.
Yeah, it also sounds like a great way for you to discover yourself a bit more. Um, and I feel like we all we all overestimate just how much we know ourselves. And meditation sounds like a great way to work towards that.
Yeah. There's,
So yeah,
oh, go
sorry.
ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I was just going to say it's hard to articulate how and when the change occurs, but through regular practice with meditation, there's becomes a sense of or a means of self honesty where you can't story tell or BS yourself
Yeah.
anymore. So going inwards in that way or whatever is a great way to get. Sometimes it's not always what you want to see, but it's the mirror that you kind of hold up to your own soul and the way that you're the real intentions you have behind your actions become really clear.
Yeah, and you have to face the uncomfortable truth and perhaps even work towards whatever it is. Like maybe this is undesirable to you and you want to change that. That is personal development. I
Yeah.
guess. Yeah. So relating to our topic for today with regards to trauma, what effect does trauma have on someone's mental and physical health that meditation can help to offset?
Yeah. So if we look at what we understand about some of the kind of major clusters of, we call them like symptom clusters related to trauma or traumatic stress, and hypervigilance is one of those. So hypervigilance is almost, if you think of your mind and your body as well, operating sort of like a computer, in that there's always this program running in the back that is sensing for potential risk, danger, or threats. And when you got that part of the both your physical hypervigilance and your psychological hypervigilance, it makes it difficult to focus and have attention in any one particular given area. So hypervigilance is one of those components. Another area is rumination. So again, if we think of these things as these are sort of habits of the mind as well as psychological states. But the rumination, so going back and repeatedly revisiting past events, sometimes we're ruminating on future events, so worry about what might happen, and playing out scenarios about potential negative outcomes for things. So thinking sometimes about the past and sometimes worrying about the future. So rumination and hypervigilance, those are two of the key elements. And a third sort of symptom cluster or whatever, it tends to also be, it can be explosive anger, aggression, or rage. And part of that is born out of sometimes in terms of frustration and the keyed up physical neurophysiology of the sympathetic nervous system, where we're kind of always on edge in that sort of fight or flight mode. The flip side of that, which can be part of the symptomology too, can be numbing and complete shutdown. So also what we think of as the freeze or collapse response. So not feeling anything, not responding to anything. So it can be two sides of what seems like the same coin. And it depends in part on somebody's sort of neurophysiology, and we go in cycles of being sort of high energy and then cycles of being low energy.
Yeah. So how do meditation practices differ from traditional therapeutic approaches in addressing trauma?
I think one of the things that's unique about it, and I'll look at a little bit how this differs from what we think of like sort of clinical or therapeutic approaches, maybe that might be didactic therapy or those, is that sometimes people don't necessarily have the insight or understanding about the trauma. Sometimes it hasn't necessarily come to the forefront of their mind or isn't understood as that. And it doesn't necessarily have to be insight oriented. So people don't have to share and verbalize what their trauma is, or they may or may not be aware of it. But through the meditation practices, and especially the mind-body approaches, as we think of sort of like with mindfulness-based stress reduction, it's an intentional rest and restoration approach to both habits of the mind, as well as addressing the becoming aware and connected with the physical sensations in the body. And what you're doing is not only giving your body and your mind an opportunity for intentional rest and restoration during the meditation practices, which are usually focused on somewhat being still, but it also, during that periods of stillness, you're not only restoring, kind of bringing balance back, but we're not busy and we're not running from anything. And it can give an opportunity for things to come up and for things to surface. And so through the process, sometimes the understanding of what traumas have occurred can surface. And if you already know what those are, it can give you an opportunity to both get some rest and restoration from it, but then also have the capacity to turn towards, look at, and expose yourself to it with enough of a reservoir, a neurophysiological reservoir, as well as a cognitive resiliency sort of reservoir to take whatever might come from those memories surfacing or from examining what it is.
Right. And could you walk us through what the journey of recovery with mindfulness-based meditation might be like?
So I think one of the things that's important to kind of note is that like continued practice, or it's more than like going maybe for an afternoon of meditation, may allow somebody to sort of touch into, get familiar with it and explore it. But it really is continued practice that is helpful. Having said that, certainly doing something like a retreat can be very beneficial as well, but that's a luxury that I think few people have the opportunity to do. And so regular sort of daily practice, even if it's 10 or 15 minutes when you're getting started, can help to establish new changes in neuroplasticity and new neural networks of having insight and changing how we, rather than react to, but maybe respond to situations. And so with mindfulness-based approaches to trauma or mindfulness-based approaches to stress reduction, there's 3 key practices, and I'll relate these to trauma. So there's the sort of what we call sitting meditation or awareness of breath meditation, which is sort of you're watching the habits of the mind. It allows you to become familiar with your own thoughts and processes, and it also allows an opening for things to surface so that you can manage and work with them. There is also body practices, so like gentle stretching or yoga is one component of it. And what that allows for is dropping into and becoming familiar with physical sensations in the body, which most of our actions and originate through sensations in the body. So drawing that connection between what are the sensations, how do they relate to our thoughts, and how do they relate to our thoughts relate to our emotions. So there's kind of a triangle between those pieces. And then body scan is a third component. So scanning in through the body, having a real clear sense or granularity of familiarity with the sensations in various parts of the body. Because again, it's sensations in the body. There's nonverbal components of trauma that are really essential to tapping into and understanding and connecting with those sensations with, again, emotions and thoughts. The emotions and thoughts have a bidirectional connection between what's happening in the mind and what's happening in the body. And so we're really trying to strengthen that awareness and connection between how do those two pieces relate to one another. Because in the case of trauma, whether it's current ongoing trauma or if it's past traumas, which we might think of as like post-traumatic or post-traumatic stress, there is a need to regulate and sort of co-regulate between what's happening physiologically and what's happening in the mind. And when we don't know what that connection is between the two, or we can't kind of understand how one might feed the other, they can fuel each other. And an example of that would be if we think of anxiety. So anxiety is very much experienced in the body and it's very much experienced in the mind. And anybody who's had a panic attack or struggles with anxiety knows that the more you think about being anxious, the more your body reacts. The more your body reacts, the more one starts to have a panic attack. And so there's this bidirectional piece. And so the mindfulness-based or meditative practices can help to gain insight into that and help us to start to unwind that pattern and interrupt how we respond to sort of the triggers that otherwise, as part of trauma, those triggers start us down a particular path for where do we seek refuge? What are we running away from? What are we running toward?
Yeah, that sounds really interesting. But is there a learning curve at all to starting meditation?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's why if you're any good approach to meditation or mindfulness practice would start with, a short sort of opening orientation to maybe a 5-minute meditation that might even be a little bit long. You do that, maybe try that if you could do it every day for a week, and maybe the next week you might try 10 minutes.
Yeah.
So you're building on that. Yeah. You're not going to just jump into it and you're going to sit on the cushion for an hour.
I think at this point, like, I'm so not used to sitting on a cushion for any amount of period at all, that sitting on it for an hour would make my behinds hurt.
Yes. Yeah.
So yeah, definitely starting small. And I know this probably ranges or varies across different people. But if you could give a ballpark or an approximate, how long would you say it normally takes before any effects can be observed from this meditation practice?
Honestly, I would say so. One, if I explain a little bit about some of it, so one of the areas that we've been doing a lot of work with is military veterans with traumatic stress. And when we first started doing this work, like in, I don't know, like around 2010, it was the idea of mindfulness and meditation with veterans was still sort of a little bit foreign. So we kept trying to find how can we take this, what was known as sort of an 8-week protocol where you're supposed to practice 2 hours a week in this program. How can we cut that down to something that might be tolerable for people who aren't open to this idea? So we played around with it until we found sort of what was the sweet spot of where we started to see actual neurophysiological changes and changes in neural networks in the brain. And we found that practicing as little as 1 hour a week for 4 weeks, we started to see changes in terms of like decreases in cortisol output, which is associated with stress and dysregulation of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And we also found changes in neural networks associated with cognitive load, stress, and different areas of attention, working memory, and the like. So that's pretty profound that just doing it 1 hour a week of practice, which could be 15 minutes of sitting meditation, 15 minutes of yoga, and 30 minutes of body scan or something like that, to have marked changes, not only in self-reports for how people feel, but we'll start to see neurophysiological changes.
Yeah. And suddenly, like, especially with all of the verbalizing that you mentioned before, that would be really, really hard to do if you're not quite sure what the issue is yet. It sounds like it's an incredibly effective way to address trauma. But alongside meditation, what other practices or approaches would work particularly well in maybe supporting the journey, such as like support systems or community involvement and things like that?
Yeah, certainly if you have support systems, if you look at a community, we find that people have sort of get more fast track benefits if they have a community of practice. But that can be sometimes hard to find. But I think when we talk about the issue of trauma, especially, is if you have like sort of an affinity group or community that you trust. So if you're a member of a community that has been marginalized or has experienced similar traumas, practicing in that community and also finding sort of traditional strategies that are consistent but bring the same essence to it can be really helpful. And a case in point, in the United States, I have some brilliant colleagues that have been working to try to adapt the standard mindfulness-based stress reduction program to Native American communities and drawing on Native American practices that are often sort of quiet, reflective practices, sometimes involving things like beading or the arts, bringing that same mindset to these other practices that are consistent and familiar within that culture also yield the same type of benefits. So it doesn't have to be, we were joking before about sitting on a cushion and being uncomfortable. It can be, there can be many different ways to engage in the same practice. And it's a matter of cultivating the mindset and the intention that you bring to what you're doing. So playing music, running, swimming, walking. And it's a matter of doing those things, but with the intention of getting to know yourself and being aware of how you're responding to and reacting to thoughts that come up, physical sensations, and the like. It can take lots of different forms. We've just, I think, done the most in terms of research around sort of the westernized approach and standard approach, and found that works. And now the matter is to say, okay, what are the bare bones and essence of this, and how can we translate this into other cultures and communities that people can take from this something that they're familiar with that will fit.
That sounds incredible, and it's really well said as well. But lastly, I wanted to ask you, what advice do you have for those considering meditation as an option for their trauma recovery, but might still be on the fence?
Right. I think a good thing. So you had asked a question before about sort of support systems, and I was talking about communities of support. And if you have that, that's wonderful. But a lot of times people are isolated. They may not be physically isolated, but they can be really emotionally isolated. And trauma also often comes with a lot of sometimes a sense of shame. And that can be really difficult to be alone with. And so if a person can have access to a trusted mental health specialist, that would be great, because sometimes things will come up. But if they don't, to be aware of the potential for things to come up and to have a plan for how to respond to those. And one of the things I'm most familiar with is I used to run sexual assault crisis services, and I have unfortunately never run a mindfulness-based program where I have not had somebody become aware of a past history of a sexual trauma. So that being in your body and being still can sometimes open the opportunity for us to recognize, name, and become aware of things that we have already been there and have already been sometimes wreaking havoc on our bodies and our minds. But that stillness can be an opening for those things to become really clear and come to the forefront of our mind. So that's a caution, but it doesn't mean not to do it, because we're already suffering and struggling with those components or those histories. Just haven't been able to look at them.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. Now we'll move on to the practices and habits section. And my first question for you is, what is a habit that you would recommend practicing alongside meditation to support its efficacy?
So I was talking about some of the body-based practices. So whether that's stretching, yoga, some sort of embodied movement, is I think really, really important, because, and I think sometimes more important, it's an underappreciated part of the aspect of meditation and mindfulness, because there's also an understanding of that it's tight body, tight mind, and tight mind, tight body. Those two go hand in hand. And there's and we talk about having issues in our tissues or whatever, there's very much a lot of these components are stored in our body, and we have to work the body as well as the mind. And it doesn't mean working out per se, but being gentle with the body, stretching, feeling into some of those areas, because we hold a lot of stored memory in our muscles, and sometimes that's trauma, and sometimes it's stress. Sometimes it's a crossover of both. So I think some sort of intentional physical movement that people can pair with that can be really helpful. And for people who can't sit still on the cushion, some people have high energy. Sometimes we think of it as attention deficit disorder, but movement and awareness of the breath, it's bringing your mind into connecting it with your breath as you're moving, can also be a way that can be conducive for meditation.
Mm-hmm. And are there any resources like books or guided apps or websites that you would recommend for people who want to learn a bit more about these body-based practices that can support their meditation journey?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's certainly a lot of nice pay for apps and things like that, but there's also some really good free resources. So there's Insight Meditation Group, and I think they have the Insight Timer. It's INSIGHT, which I think is also connected with the global Insight Meditation Network. And they have those. If you look at the Insight Meditation Centers, have free, literally free housing, free food, free. You can go to the retreats there. Sometimes they're weekend retreats, sometimes they're longer 10-day retreats, and you can learn all of those practices. But as I said, going to a retreat is a luxury that many people don't have the opportunity to do. So they have free apps. There's the free websites for that as well. I'm familiar from the United States. There's the Veterans Affairs Administration has a mindful coach app that is free that folks can use, that walks through all of these different elements. And so you can find these resources. There are other things like Headspace is really good. That's globally well embraced, and they have often like sort of a sliding scale. Sometimes if you're connected with a group, you can get certain groups, you can get discount codes. There's also a lot of good resources, videos on YouTube. Bessel van der Kolk, who does a lot on The Body Keeps the Score, looking at trauma and embodiment around that, has some wonderful resources. And there's the trauma-informed mindfulness practices by Mr. Terrell Evan, and he has a whole series also of accessible free resources.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. Now we're moving on to the open mic section, and this is your chance to talk about anything that you're passionate about, and it doesn't have to be related to the topic. So I'm really excited to see what you'll be sharing with us. The floor is yours. Take it away.
Well, I think I'm a nerd at heart, and so I probably talked about a lot of the things that I'm really interested in.
Fair enough.
Fair enough, yes. And I'm really fascinated by, and I want to say just constantly excited by the explosion of research on neuroscience and what it shows us, especially when we look at these areas of how the brain and the body can rewire, rework, and heal themselves in a relatively short period of time. Through, I think, what are really ancient practices. And as I said, these are practices really born more from your part of the world, from the Eastern and Pacific Islander area that we've been really fortunate to have spread throughout the world. The other thing I'm really passionate about is just meeting people from different places. So I've traveled all over the world, and I feel, I want to say, I have optimism and hope for humanity. The more I see people in other places, we're more similar than we are dissimilar. And it's very energizing.
That is so sweet. What's been your most memorable encounter with someone that you've met overseas?
I had the pleasure of spending about 6 months in Thailand, and I was there actually studying some of the sort of Buddhist-based practices for recovery of in addiction and trauma, and just met the most amazing people. Even if you can't speak the language, there is communication and connection that transcends our normal ways of sort of culturally communicating with each other. Yeah, I would say that was probably one of the most standout experiences.
That is so heartwarming to hear. Thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. I loved hearing you talk about all the research that you found on meditation, and all of your recommended resources sound amazing and so helpful. So we'll be linking those in the show notes. Before I let you go off, tell us where our listeners can find you online if they want to find out more about what you do and your work.
Well, being the old school nerd that I am, I think they have to go to Scholar Google and look up my name. Find links to all of my research, or go to Syracuse University website and type my name in, and the faculty page with all of my nerdy work will come up there.
I just got to say that is so iconic. Where can our listeners find you? You've got to go to scholar.google.com. That's just the most iconic thing ever, and I love that. We'll be linking those in the show notes below. Thank you so much, Dessa, for joining us today, and thank you everyone for tuning in. We'll catch you in the next episode. You've been listening to the Self-Improvement Atlas, the Personal Science Insights podcast, produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. For more episodes like this from 10 different life management perspectives, search LMSL on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts, so you can get updated on everything we have to offer. We have a wide range of topics readily available for you to check out. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider rating our show, sharing it, and subscribing to our channel, as it helps us grow and bring you more quality resources. More of our work can be found on our website at pe.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Marie Stella. Thanks for tuning in.